The UFO Deception, An Orthodox Christian Perspective by Father Spyridon Bailey. Chapter 1, A Reliable Witness. On New Year's Eve in 1978, a couple were driving with their 13-year-old daughter to a family party in Rotherham in the north of England. They were heading from the outskirts of Sheffield along a stretch of road where there wasn't much housing. It was still early evening, but the December sky had already turned dark black. The lack of light from buildings or street lights only added to the darkness of the night. As they traveled down a long, straight stretch of road bordered by fields on either side, they saw something ahead of them in the distance. The young girl, who is now 56 in 2021, takes up the story. We first saw a golden light ahead of us. My dad made a joke about it looking like a UFO, and we all laughed. As we continued driving, we all watched it getting closer, and my dad slowed down so he could focus on it. As the light slowly moved toward us, we pulled into a lay-by at the side of the road, all of us now very quiet. It kept coming in our direction until it was about 20 meters away over the hedge of the field from us, and once it came alongside, it stopped moving and hovered where it was. I couldn't believe how big it was. Bigger than a double-decker bus, it just hung silently next to us. It was shaped like a cigar, a golden cigar without any windows or seams, completely smooth, but you could tell it was solid. As it had moved, it left a long, golden trail behind it that stretched back along where it had been. Even though it was golden, it didn't look ghostly. It looked like a real object. I remember looking back and forth at my mom and dad. I had to confirm to myself they were looking at the same thing I was seeing. If I had been by myself, I would have doubted I had seen it or thought I had hallucinated it. It was just so incredible. They were obviously looking at the same thing in the sky. Their mouths were open, and they just stared at it in silence. In the end, I had to ask them if they were seeing the cigar-shaped object I could see, and they nodded, without saying a word. After a few seconds, my dad reached for the door handle to get out of the car, but I asked him to stay with us, which he did. A few more seconds passed before the object slowly and silently began to pull away from us and followed an arc over the field. It then began to speed up and pulled away very fast, and I remember being amazed at how its height above the ground didn't change, like it was following an exact path or plane. We didn't really feel fear or anything special. There was just an enormous sense of surprise at seeing something so strange that we couldn't understand. I remember knowing it was like nothing people could make. It was beyond the technology of our time. It didn't make us emotional in any way. And all these years later, I can say it never affected me in any way. I was never interested in that kind of thing, and seeing this didn't make me want to find out about them. It just always struck me as an odd event. As it pulled away, we realized that another car had pulled in behind us, but once the object was gone, we didn't get out to speak to them. My dad just pulled out into the road, and we headed to the party. When we arrived, my mom ran in telling everyone we had seen a UFO, and they all laughed at her. For the whole night, we were the butt of everybody's jokes, and my dad never mentioned it again. 2 days later, it was in the newspapers that these things had been seen up and down the country, and I remember when the new term started going back to school and telling everyone about it, they all mocked me terribly, so I never mentioned it again. I kept quiet about it for the next 40 years, but I kept a newspaper cutting in a box of things. I began this book with this account, which is so like countless other experiences described by witnesses of UFOs, because it comes from my wife. We hear stories of strange experiences, and often we are suspicious. We question the honesty of the storyteller. We may even wonder about their sanity. I have shared in this kind of skepticism and looked for explanations to brush aside such claims. But faced with someone I have absolute trust in, I am confronted with the realization that there is indeed a genuine experience behind these accounts. Having a witness I can believe is enough to convince me. But for other people, my wife's testimony is just one more familiar claim to something unexplainable. Therefore, more evidence is needed, which I will try to provide. I had been reading Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future by Father Spyridon Bailey, which had prompted my wife to tell me of her experience and dig out the old newspaper cutting, which can be seen below. In it, the reporter describes how thousands of people reported seeing spaceships in the skies on New Year's Eve. He goes on to say that quote-unquote UFO sightings came from as far apart as Cornwall and the Scottish Highlands. Witnesses reported seeing huge ships as well as sightings of the cigar-shaped objects seen by my wife and her family. Other details, such as the long vapor trail mentioned by my wife, were described by many people. Father Spyridon was writing in the 1970s, and his treatment of the topic came as a chapter in a book covering a number of subjects. With the release of the official documents by the UK government and footage claimed to be of UFOs by the US Navy, I decided in 2020 to read further and attempt to understand what lies behind the phenomenon. As I researched the topic, I became more convinced of the accuracy of Father Spyridon Bailey's interpretation of the events, and I decided a more thorough presentation was needed. The material covering this topic is almost endless. Articles, websites, books, and now documentaries, and a whole series of television programs are produced on it. On any single day, there are at least 2 programs about UFOs or aliens as part of Sky TV's output in the UK. But with few exceptions, the Orthodox Christian perspective is missing, and so conclusions are reached based on materialistic, occult, or heretical thinking. But in fact, there is a wealth of writing from the Church to support us in our understanding of this phenomenon, and also how we should respond to it. I am fully aware that for many devotees of the myth of aliens, the perspective here will be uncomfortable. However, the evidence is strong for arguing that there are 2 phenomena taking place in parallel, and that those behind each are using the other as a mask for their activities. It is a very real deception carried out by those who need to conceal their actions from us. There is a great deal of confusion created by this, particularly among those who wish to explain all UFO sightings and encounters as either one thing or the other. I will attempt to demonstrate that this approach is flawed and only leaves us vulnerable to the deception. So let us return to the issue of a reliable witness. As I have said, I have certainty that there is something real happening, that we aren't only dealing with liars or those looking for attention, though this may be the case on some or many occasions. I have the testimony of my wife, so my first objective before looking at the details of the phenomenon, its characteristics, effects, and dangers, is to present evidence that will convince you that we are talking about something that cannot be rejected as fantasy. We will then consider the changing nature of the phenomenon through recent history and how the philosophies and cultural assumptions of different times have shaped the interpretation of what is happening. We will also observe how the phenomenon is being used by military agencies, and how the idea of the ETs has proved convenient for them. But I hope to convince you that the modern story of aliens visiting us from other planets is worse than a myth. It is a deception.